Hello and welcome to this very interesting and pertinent conversation that I'll be having with Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya. I'm Dwivedi and we'll be in conversation for India Foundation special series that focus on what's happening right now as far as the BIMSTEC is concerned. Thank you so much for taking out the time, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya.
Pleasure.
And there's a lot to discuss. You've been ambassador to Myanmar, Afghanistan, Syria, and Myanmar is one of the member nations for BIMSTEC, and after the regional summit there are enough and more issues and challenges and opportunities to discuss, and we'll pan this out over the next half an hour. And I want to start by asking you that the summit that took place last month in Sri Lanka, do you think it's a reset as far as BIMSTEC is concerned, because the regional grouping hasn't really been hasn't performed as much as what many would have assumed it to, and it languished in terms of the role it could play in the region. Do you think the summit could act as a reset, as an inflection point going forward?
Thank you, Gauri, for having me on this program. So let me begin by saying that yes, I think we all have to acknowledge, the founders as well as the later members, that BIMSTEC is a very prominent grouping of countries. It lies at the fulcrum of South Asia, Southeast Asia, in the middle of our neighborhood first, Act East and Indo-Pacific strategies, and overall sort of a very important location in the Bay of Bengal. But it has been slow to start. And we saw that it went into summit mode sometime around 2004. We had another summit in 2008, 2014. And since then, in fact, actually it has been India that has injected a little life into it when the Prime Minister invited the BIMSTEC leaders to the BRICS summit in Goa in 2016. Subsequently, we had the Kathmandu summit in 2018. And in between, of course, we've had COVID. So I do think that actually there have been steady incremental moves since about 2014. Before that, it was a little more deeply in slumber. And what we have seen since 2014 is that a secretariat has come up in Bangladesh. And this time, I think a very major step was taken in adopting finally the charter of the BIMSTEC. Yes. I think along with that, they also adopted a couple of important MOUs and agreements, particularly some that have been in the works for some time. For example, this master plan on transport and connectivity. Yes. So I think there is a kind of, and I think largely sort of pushed by India, there is a movement within the BIMSTEC. But we are a far cry from where we want to be or where we should be, given the fact that the heart of this lies in the Bay of Bengal. Yes. And we have not really seen any major lift in Bay of Bengal trade, Bay of Bengal economy, the whole, yes. We talk about the blue economy, but in fact there has not been much movement in terms of the overall Bay of Bengal trade. And I think it would be useful actually to go back to the colonial period, when the British were effectively the drivers of the economy of the subcontinent, and radiating out from Calcutta, you had a whole series of ports going from Akyab to Rangoon to Moulmein to the Malaysian ports and yes. eventually to Singapore. But that was part of a colonial economy. Now we are, we are in a different situation. It's no longer a colonial economy. We don't want to be a colonial economy. There has been partition and subsequently Bangladesh, so there has been a fracturing yes. of the geography, political geography of this area. But at the same time, we have this energy coming from initially Look East and now Act East. And there is a desire to look towards Southeast Asia as a kind of growth engine yes. For the region. So I think the conditions are there. I think the actual chemistry still need to take place.
Yes. You're right. There's a lot in terms of maritime cooperation that needs to be done and trade opportunity. I remember, first I heard about BIMSTEC was almost 20 years back, and even then there was talk about, how there is a huge trade opportunity that exists. It's unfortunate that 2 decades later we're still talking about an opportunity. It's frankly an opportunity lost. But I was just looking at the ASEAN trade and comparing it to BIMSTEC, just to get a sense of how much can regional groupings really contribute to each other's economy. ASEAN trade is upwards of $600 billion and BIMSTEC trade is sub $70 billion. So there's, of course, there's no comparison. B, but it also does suggest that somebody needs to, or the nations need to now just grab the trading opportunity with both hands. Do you think that can now happen? Again, I'm talking in the backdrop of the summit, because there's now more sense of optimism in terms of the future that holds for the grouping.
So let's take stock of a couple of things. One is, I think, let's not forget that for a greater part of these last 20 years, political conditions have not been very ripe. Myanmar was still more or less stuck in its in its insular period. Relations with Bangladesh were not that great. The Bangladesh economy is now beginning to, really move. For a long time, it was languished in the category of least developed countries. Now it has very high human development indices, and the growth is also good. Myanmar looked up in between during the 10 years between Thein Sein's government and the first NLD government, but right now is in a state of severe political crisis. And by and large, a lot of the economies, other than India and say Thailand on the other side, are not very highly developed economies, or economies that can make a big impression regionally. You're talking about Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka too is in a state of economic crisis. Yes. On the other hand, ASEAN is moving ahead, still moving ahead, and you have international crises like the pandemic of COVID, as well as now the Ukraine crisis, which in some ways is pushing us towards much greater regional supply chains, much greater regional cooperation, maybe even a degree of integration. Yes. You were right in pointing out the trade statistics. If you look at it, actually the intra-BIMSTEC trade is 5%. Yeah. And I think even ASEAN is much more, about 30% within the ASEAN itself. So there's a huge deficit to overcome. But I think the problem really lies in the fact that much of these economies are still highly underdeveloped. They haven't tapped their biggest potentials. And when I say big potentials, I say one is, of course, the blue economy. Bay of Bengal has not really been, when I say exploitation, I mean in a sustainable way, because today we can't do plain rampant extraction and extraction alone. We have to think in terms of how you build natural capital as well, but also the agricultural economy. I think we tend to focus a lot on the industries without realizing that 70% of the economies of these countries are largely rural and agri-based. And we haven't yet invested sufficiently in the agri-base of these economies. If we were to do this, then there would be a natural kind of, natural momentum to the economies.
Okay, so and we talk at a time when there's so much expectation of maritime cooperation, more so given that this region is also now in a lot of prominence. The Indo-Pacific and the South China Sea, the whole region is now in discussions for various reasons. Do you see that having an overhang in nations coming together for greater maritime cooperation? Whether it is Sri Lanka, whether it is Thailand, Myanmar, all of them do have requirements of greater maritime cooperation, more so given what is happening in the Indo-Pacific region. Do you think that could act as a catalyst?
So again, when we talk of maritime cooperation, actually very often we end up talking in somewhere in a kind of security environment.
But there's also marine economy.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I'm glad that you clarified that, because very often a lot of what we are talking about is maritime cooperation for, let's say, shipping, or essentially security based. But yes, I think there is the marine economy that is, as I mentioned, the Bay of Bengal marine economy is very important. But I think the other thing that you were alluding to was that suddenly the region has become much more strategically important, because not only is there a greater consciousness of the importance of the Indian Ocean trade and the importance of trade through these areas to the East Asia.
The overarching presence of China.
The overarching presence of China, now the activities of the Quad and the Americans, Brits and the Australians with AUKUS, Japan becoming a much more active partner of India. Exactly. The Chinese active on the Belt and Road Initiative. After all, they have something called the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. Yes. deep sea port in Myanmar, and on the western side, which we can leave out the rest. But so there is suddenly a lot more activity on the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific, and I think that is what is sort of is enhancing or the profile of this region, and actually it is having the effect of taking a greater interest in the economy as well. But we still don't have the as I said, chemistry earlier, but the kind of business to business relations that will actually kickstart even many of the the soft infrastructure that is required. For example, a lot of the shipping in this area would be coastal shipping. I know that the BIMSTEC has been working on a coastal shipping agreement, largely pushed by Thailand, but we haven't yet reached that. Even the coastal shipping agreements between the countries of the region are not yet very mature enough. So a lot of the trade, just as we talk about building an economy from the bottom, a lot of the trade will take place, will be coastal trade between one part of the Bay of Bengal to another part. And if we go back a little bit into history, we shouldn't forget that the Bay of Bengal actually was a very thriving trade area. And traditionally you had the Arabs, you had the Tamils who were traversing this area, connecting to Indonesia, to Malaysia, present-day Malaysia. Even in Myanmar, there were Tamil communities that traded with these areas. So in a way, that kind of, trade revival involving littoral communities, coastal communities, is still waiting to be.
I'm sure, and that is really the premise of the grouping coming together. So then let's talk about what
Actually,
could
very
be
often in BIMSTEC, we forget the B stands for Bay of Bengal.
Bay of Bengal.
It's really the most important.
Yes, exactly, and that's the premise of the countries coming together. So what do you think should be the next few steps? And a lot of this has to be driven by India. It is like the real big brother taking all the nations together, member nations together, and also India has to play that role. What do you think could be those 3-4 important milestones that India needs to reach for lifting BIMSTEC?
The first one that I mentioned is a coastal shipping agreement. The second, I would say, is again another thing that I think we've been working on but not reached anywhere, which is a free trade agreement. And a free trade meaning free trade in goods, services and investment.
India is on an FTA signing spree,
Right.
so there's every reason to assume that.
Right.
This
So again, what tends to happen is we tend to go for FTAs with the more advanced and developed economies because we are looking for technology, capital, know-how and things like that. But actually we tend to ignore the lower hanging fruit, which is FTAs with countries that are actually in a less well-developed state than us. So for example, though it does not directly connect to the CLMV countries, Myanmar is the least developed country in that area. So I was actually coming to the role of investment and cross-investment. For example, we tend to talk a lot in trade, but we tend to think in terms of trade by manufacture here and then exporting or importing between countries. But what many of these free trade agreements, particularly in investments, offer, or these comprehensive economic partnerships that we offer you the opportunity of investment-led trade. In other words, a country like India, which is a stronger economy, can invest in the less developed economies of the BIMSTEC region and create a market for those products in this entire BIMSTEC region. And you're talking about a market of over 3 billion within the BIMSTEC, or at least close to 3 trillion economy. 3 trillion economy, and in terms of population also probably close to close
actually 3.8 trillion. I was
3.8 trillion, and in terms of population also, if you put India, Bangladesh and others together,
so a fifth of the world's population.
So you're coming to basically about 1.6, 1.7 billion. So it is a huge market. So investment-led trade, and within that investment, it wouldn't surprise you that I would emphasize actually invest in the agri-economies, in the rural economies, because that is where 70% of the people are earning their livelihood from. And that's on the one side. And on the other side, you have, of course, the marine economy. that you mentioned. The marine economy means many things. It means the coastal shipping agreement, it means ports, it means actually shipping services, it means the goods that you can have to exchange with each other.
Yes.
And again, that can be helped by investments, cross investments. So I think we need to work much more overall, I would say, on much greater volumes of investment by the countries of BIMSTEC and within the region.
And then how much are we talking in terms of sizable investments to really make a dent for this to, sort of be worth everybody's while, so to say,
I think you're touching on a lot of my sort of pet themes now. One is sizable investment. So, there are two kinds again. One can have large investments, a few large investments, or one can have small investments on a large scale. Now, when you're thinking of an agri-rural economy, mostly what you would be thinking of is processing the produce of that economy. And actually, you don't need very large capitals. You don't need very large projects. You don't need all the sort of destructive consequences that come out of that. You can do a lot by doing small on a large scale.
True.
Which means that there is a tremendous opportunity for things like small and medium enterprises, creative entrepreneurship, creative businesses, innovation. I forgot to mention one area, services.
Yes.
India is strong on services. We are particularly strong on IT-based services. We have evolved, we have developed IT-based apps for governance, for commerce, and for a number of other things. I don't think we have really fully, we have made some steps with things like extending RuPay to Myanmar and to Bhutan and so on. But I think there is a lot more scope in the broadly what I would call is the IT economy, which includes everything, going up to e-commerce and payment systems, financial systems. So there's another huge opportunity. We have health-based apps. We can have many more.
In fact, health is a huge area.
Correct.
Where, post-COVID, there has to be a lot of focus, and
Right.
India can really play the
Absolutely,
lead there
yeah,
again.
Yeah. So you're thinking that there's a lot of stuff that we have done here for our own citizens or for our own economy that could easily,
in some
just
manner.
you write piggyback on that and bring it to other countries. It can be commercial, it can be development cooperation, but it's a way of overcoming a lot of the connectivity, physical connectivity problems that we have.
And surprisingly, as you mentioned, this is a region where there are deep cultural links, deep civilizational links, and ideally there should be very deep people-to-people connect, paving the way for trade to happen. But that isn't the case. Trade is not flourishing despite deep civilizational links, because those people-to-people connect, I believe, is still not where it can be. Do you think that also needs to be worked at? And again, India needs to sort of really play the role of setting the stage for that to happen?
Absolutely. We already have one platform, which is the fact that a lot of these countries are Buddhist. For many of them, Bodh Gaya or the Buddhist pilgrimage, is a very important part of their aspirations. So you already have a basic platform that is provided by these, what you call cultural, religious and civilizational links. Obviously, these need to be supplemented and augmented by much more tourist traffic.
Yes.
In a country like Myanmar has close to 2 million people of Indian origin, right? Just imagine just the sheer traffic come out of just that. A lot of them are originally Tamil. Yes. So, we still don't have an air connection between, let's say, Yangon and Chennai, or something like that. Yes. So there are huge holes in the air services that we can provide. I think Vietnam has taken a good leaf out of the book and has started and recently resumed some services which had suffered on account of COVID. But clearly what happens is air services and connectivity very often flow from people to people or business ties and then contribute to it in return. Yes. So that kind of dialectic, that kind of dynamic has somehow escaped so far. Yeah. And partly because, there's already very well developed centers like Singapore and Thailand, which tend to act as hubs and, tend to attract all the traffic. And so recreating that. And initially, as you know, Rangoon used to be the Bangkok of Southeast Asia. All the airlines used to actually fly through Rangoon.
Yeah.
But over the period of military dictatorship, it's surrendered that advantage. And now it's not so easy to get it back.
No, it isn't. And more so, since we are talking about Myanmar, I want to also touch upon the security aspect of it. I was speaking to several diplomats and several experts, and they did point out that when you talk about this region, one cannot undermine the security challenges that we're talking about. There is the Rohingyas, then there are the security challenges that come out of political upheaval. We are seeing that in Nepal, we're seeing that in Sri Lanka, over and above what is happening in Myanmar. So that also needs to be waded through when you're talking about a future of BIMSTEC. Now, I want to ask you, how does India overcome those challenges? Because it's primarily New Delhi that has to shoulder this burden. How can India wade through these serious challenges?
I think it was because of a consciousness of this that somewhere, I think with the Kathmandu summit, security which had not been, and counterterrorism which had not been really elements of what was essentially a technical and economic cooperation body, were brought into it. But I would actually sort of ring a cautionary bell on over-securitizing or overlooking the security aspects, because security is important, and no doubt there are political problems that do need to be addressed. But there is a lot of scope for business.
So you're saying trade is the backbone of BIMSTEC?
I would say trade and investment is the backbone. And I'm not saying that trade and investment can cure and solve all the political and security problems, because political and security problems typically have their origins in political and security problems. And they need to be addressed, and clearly by including it, we have done something in that direction. But I would not sort of make that into a kind of, I would not let that come in the way of greater regional cooperation. And that you can see even, let's say, between India and Myanmar. There are Indian insurgent groups that are active in Myanmar. There have been Indian insurgent groups that have been active in Bangladesh and Bhutan as well.
Yes.
At the same time, we've been able to develop our relationships with these countries.
So then, now that a charter has been adopted and architecture has been institutionalized, now there's going to be a summit every 2 years, there's going to be ministerial meetings. Where do you see this BIMSTEC, the grouping 2 years from now? Where do you see this 2 years from now, after the architecture being institutionalized, after a fresh commitment from all the member countries?
I would really like to see movement on the free trade agreement. We've had a problem with the RCEP, right? I mentioned to you a bias that we have towards FTAs with the more advanced economies.
Yes.
I think we need to really look at FTAs with the economies, with the smaller economies, because they don't have as many hang-ups about issues like protectionism and so on, because they don't have the industries to protect.
Yes.
To them, it does not matter whether they import from China or from India, if they don't produce that good, because they would actually like to have both markets to the extent possible. So I would say that all those things that I mentioned, the coastal agreement, investment in the agri-rural sector, investment in general in the lesser economies, in the poorer economies. I think these are the ways that are, and generally a much stronger role to investment. That means from India's point of view, it has to be much more external investment from India outwards into the region.
Yes.
And we should not count it as a net loss, because these are opportunity costs, these are comparative advantages that we would be taking advantage of.
Yes.
And we would be linking those geographies as part of this regional value chain.
Yes.
And that is really what is real integration. We talk about globalization, we talk about global value chains, but we need to really begin from the region.
We need to begin in our neighborhood,
in our own neighborhood.
backyard. Yes.
So I would like to see BIMSTEC evolve in that area where we think of this area as a common investment area, and overcome if we actually start off with these economies, we'll be much better prepared to integrate with RCEP and, you know, the other sort of trade
linkages in the region.
the
All
trade
right.
groupings that are done.
Yes. All right. Let's leave it at that. Thank you so much for having this conversation, and we're leaving on a very optimistic and a very positive note as far as BIMSTEC is concerned. Enthusiastic about BIMSTEC 2.0, if I may say so, given the renewed commitments, with the hope that the grouping is going to meet some of its potential and the opportunity that exists in front of us. Thanks so much.
I really
this.
hope it works, because this is for the better, you know, it is really for the advantage of our eastern states and provinces.
Absolutely.
Including the northeast.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for watching this very special conversation.